Scattered across New Jersey, hidden in forests, rotting on waterfronts, are places that used to be something. Big somethings. A safari park where lions mauled tourists. A fairy tale castle designed by the same architect who built Mar-a-Lago. A concrete bridge so massive it was the largest structure of its kind on the planet. All of them built with money, ambition, and the certainty that they'd be around forever. None of them are around anymore. Well, technically they are. They're just empty now, overgrown and caving in. Today we're going through 9 places in New Jersey that time forgot. Left exactly where they were the day everyone decided they didn't matter anymore. Let's start with the one that sounds like a horror movie because, honestly, it kind of was. Jungle Habitat in West Milford was a Warner Brothers safari park that opened in 1972 with over 1,000 wild animals roaming across 800 acres of Passaic County forest. The concept was you drive your car through enclosures with free roaming elephants, baboons, and Siberian tigers, and if everything went perfectly, you'd leave with all your limbs. Everything did not go perfectly. Within months of opening, a tourist rolled down his window, taunted a lion with a piece of meat, and got mauled. A baby elephant grabbed a woman with its trunk and injured her arm, costing the park a $200,000 lawsuit. Wolves and baboons escaped. An emu flat out ran off and was spotted by locals on a casual Tuesday in suburban New Jersey. Warner Brothers wanted to expand and add amusement rides, but the residents of West Milford said absolutely not because the traffic, animal escapes, and the general chaos of living next door to a discount Jurassic Park had worn thin. In November 1976, the town voted against the expansion, and Warner Brothers closed the park like they were flipping a light switch. After it shut down, newspapers reported animal carcasses were left behind to decay on the property, including an elephant. Today, the land is part of Long Pond Ironworks State Park. You can hike through the old safari roads, past rusted animal cages and remnants of enclosures slowly being swallowed by the forest. And people in West Milford supposedly still report sightings of non-native animals in the surrounding woods, though none of it's been confirmed. But nobody's been able to fully explain it either. Clinton Road, the most haunted road in America, runs right next to it, so if that doesn't set the mood, nothing will. Now we're heading to Sussex County, where fairy tales go to die. The Gingerbread Castle in Hamburg was built in 1930 by a biscuit company owner named F.H. Bennett, who saw a production of Hansel and Gretel at the Metropolitan Opera and decided, logically, to build an entire fairy tale amusement park next to his flour mill. He hired Joseph Urban, a world-famous Austrian architect who designed sets for Broadway and also designed Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach. So this wasn't some hack job. This was a real internationally significant work of fantasy architecture, built from stone and stucco with rounded spires, painted in pastel pinks and whites, sitting on the banks of the Wallkill River in rural North Jersey. For nearly 50 years, families drove up to Hamburg to walk through a castle staffed by guides dressed as Hansel and Gretel. Kids would explore rooms filled with sculptures of fairy tale characters, glow-in-the-dark murals, and a giant stone cat. The whole town leaned into it. The surrounding streets were named things like Wishing Well Road and King Cole Road. Then attendance dropped in the late 70s, and the park closed in 1978. It briefly reopened as a haunted attraction in the 80s and 90s before a fire shut it down again. Since then, a series of owners have bought the property with big restoration plans, and every single one of them has either run out of money, run into permit issues, or just quietly disappeared. The castle still sits there, fenced off, covered in graffiti, with its pastel paint fading and its fairy tale characters crumbling. It's one of the only surviving structures designed by Joseph Urban, and it's rotting behind a chain-link fence in a town most people have never heard of. Next, we go to Newark, where a jail built before the Civil War has been sitting abandoned for over 50 years, and nobody can figure out what to do with it. The old Essex County Jail was designed in 1837 by John Haviland, the same architect behind Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. It was built of brick and local brownstone in the Greek Revival style, and when it opened, it actually had indoor plumbing before the White House did. The original design included garden paths, courtyards for well-behaved inmates, and a greenhouse, also gallows because it was still a jail. Over the decades, the jail expanded to over 300 cells and became the main holding facility for Essex County. By the 1960s, it was overcrowded and falling apart. During the 1967 Newark riots, it held nearly 500 inmates in a space built for far fewer. A new jail opened in 1970, and the old one was repurposed briefly by the Essex County Narcotics Bureau before being fully abandoned in 1989. Since then, it has become one of the most haunting abandoned structures in the state. Massive floor collapses, caved-in skylights, three-story window frames that have crashed down onto the cell blocks. A fire in 2001 gutted parts of the interior. There's a literal forest growing inside the walls of the jail complex in the middle of Newark. More than a few bodies of overdose victims have been recovered from inside the building. Part of Spike Lee's Malcolm X was filmed here in 1991, which tells you exactly what it looked like 30 years ago, and it's only gotten worse. It's on the National Register of Historic Places, which has actually blocked demolition plans. A proposed science park was vetoed in 2010 because of the jail's historic designation. Columbia University grad students have drawn up 11 different reuse proposals, but none have moved forward. So the oldest government building in Essex County just sits there, surrounded by a wall, slowly caving in on itself while everyone argues about what to do with it. Now let's hike into the Ramapo Mountains, where a mansion built by a cursed woman is slowly being eaten by the forest. Slike Castle started as Foxcroft, a stone manor house built around 1910 on top of Fox Hill by a wealthy New York stockbroker named William Porter. His wife, Ruth Coles, was a nurse who had already buried one husband when she married Porter. Porter died in a car accident in 1911 while Ruth was sailing home from Europe on the Lusitania. She married a third time to an attorney named Warren Van Slyke, who died in 1925. Ruth spent the rest of her life alone on top of that mountain and died in 1940 at the age of 63. After her death, the property changed hands a couple of times before being abandoned in the early 1950s during what's believed to have been a bitter divorce. Nobody ever moved back in. In 1959, vandals broke in and set the place on fire. The stone walls survived, everything else didn't. Today, the ruins sit inside Ramapo Mountain State Forest, accessible via a moderately steep hike from the Skyline Drive parking lots. You can still trace the layout of the house. The stone walls stand several stories high. There's a swimming pool with faded blue paint still visible on the concrete, a water tower, remnants of what was once a screened porch overlooking Ramapo Lake. On a clear day, you can see the Manhattan skyline from the hilltop. The forest has completely taken over as trees grow through the walls and moss covers the stone. The whole thing looks like a scene out of a fantasy novel, except it's 30 miles from Midtown Manhattan in a state park anyone can visit for free. Now let's head to Sandy Hook, where an entire military base has been slowly falling apart since the 1970s. Fort Hancock was a coastal artillery base built to defend New York Harbor. The first gun batteries went operational in 1896, and the fort served continuously through both World Wars and into the Cold War. At its peak during World War II, over 7,000 people lived on the base, including members of the Women's Army Corps and African American soldiers before the military was officially desegregated. The fort is also home to the Sandy Hook Lighthouse, built in 1764, the oldest working lighthouse in the entire country. Fort Hancock was decommissioned in 1974 and handed to the National Park Service, and that's where things went sideways. The NPS got custody of over 100 historic buildings and didn't have the budget to maintain them. Officers Row, a line of 18 identical buff-colored brick homes built in the late 1890s, now looks like a ghost town. paint peeling, porches sagging, poison ivy so thick the Park Service had to bring in goats to eat it back. The old barracks, the enlisted men's quarters, the gun batteries along the shore, all of them in various stages of collapse. A private developer was supposed to rehabilitate 36 buildings starting in 2001. The lease was voided in 2009 because the financing fell through. Only 3 buildings were ever restored. The rest are still sitting there on a peninsula that juts into the Atlantic with the Manhattan skyline visible across the water. Concrete bunkers from the Proving Ground era have literally slid into the sand at the waterline. Inside some of them, someone painted bizarre, colorful murals that locals call the voodoo bunkers. Nobody's ever claimed credit for the artwork. It's a military base, an art installation, and a ghost town all in one. Now let's go to Warren County, where one of the largest concrete structures ever built is just sitting in the woods, covered in graffiti and daring people to climb it. The Paulina Viaduct in Knowlton Township was completed in 1910 and at the time was the largest reinforced concrete structure in the entire world. 7 arches, 1,100 feet long and 115 feet above the Paulina River. It was built by the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad as part of the Lackawanna Cutoff, a project to create a straighter, flatter route through northwestern New Jersey. The viaduct carried trains for almost 70 years as the last one crossed in 1979. The tracks were ripped up in 1984. Since then, this engineering marvel has just been sitting in the forest, slowly being reclaimed by ivy and buzzard nests, while becoming one of the most infamous trespassing spots in New Jersey. Inside each of the 7 arches are hollow chambers accessible through manholes along the old rail bed. Graffiti artists have turned these chambers into massive canvases. Some of it is genuinely impressive. Some of it is just teenagers discovering spray paint for the first time. People have been bungee jumping off this thing, partying inside it, and getting arrested on it. In 2025, a man fell roughly 100 feet and had to be airlifted to a hospital. There's a legend that a construction worker was buried alive in the wet concrete during the build and his ghost walks the rail bed at night. Local police say they arrest 15 to 20 people a month for trespassing. NJ Transit has plans to restore commuter service on part of the cutoff, and Amtrak has proposed eventually running trains over the viaduct again. But for now, the largest concrete structure of its era is just standing there in the woods near Blairstown, holding its breath. Now let's go to Wall Township, where the future of communication was literally invented, and then the whole place was just left to rot. Camp Evans started as a wireless station in 1912. Guglielmo Marconi, the guy who basically invented long-distance radio, built a transatlantic receiving station on the banks of the Shark River with 6 400-foot-tall antenna towers. This was the eastern link in Marconi's plan to wrap a wireless communication network around the entire planet. In 1914, a team led by David Sarnoff tested Edwin Armstrong's regenerative circuit here, and for the first time could clearly hear wireless messages from as far away as Hawaii and Germany. That single night changed the trajectory of global communication. The U.S. Navy seized the station during World War I. After the war, the property bounced from RCA to a group with ties to the Ku Klux Klan to a Bible college, and then in 1941, the Army bought it and renamed it Camp Evans. It became a top-secret radar research facility during World War II, and the radar tech developed here has been credited by military historians as a major factor in the Allied victory. After the war, scientists at Camp Evans bounced a radar signal off the moon in 1946, proving that space communication was possible. That project, called Project Diana, literally opened the door to the space age. They tracked Sputnik from this site and helped develop the technology behind America's first satellites. Then the Army decommissioned it in the late 1990s. Buildings were abandoned, vandals moved in, copper was stripped from the walls, asbestos sat untouched. For over a decade, one of the most important technology sites in American history was just sitting there in Monmouth County, deteriorating. A nonprofit called InfoAge eventually stepped in and turned parts of it into a science and history museum. It's now a National Historic Landmark. But large sections of the campus are still crumbling. You can walk around and see Cold War-era labs, radiation testing facilities, and satellite tracking buildings in various stages of decay. A place that helped win a world war and launch the space age, sitting in a township most people only know because it's near Belmar. Now let's climb the Palisades, where a Gilded Age mansion was deliberately destroyed by a Rockefeller, but refused to fully die. Clifdale Manor was built in 1911 for George Zabriskie, a Bergen County old money businessman who served as the New York representative for Pillsbury Flour Mills. The 15-room stone manor sat on a 25-acre estate at the top of the Palisades Cliffs in Alpine, overlooking the Hudson River. The property included terraced gardens, stone columns, sculptures, and a man-made pond near the cliff's edge. It was one of several mansions along what was known as Millionaire's Row. In 1930, John D. Rockefeller Jr. purchased the estate. Rockefeller had been quietly buying up properties along the Palisades because he feared the opening of the George Washington Bridge in 1931 would trigger overdevelopment on the cliffs. In 1933, he donated 723 acres to the Palisades Interstate Park Commission with one condition: the buildings had to come down to restore the natural skyline. The WPA began demolishing the upper floors in 1939, but the lower portion of Clifdale Manor was built directly into the hillside with walls of native stone so thick and so anchored to the cliff that they couldn't safely tear them down, so they just left them there. Today, the ruins sit along the Long Path Trail, about a half-mile north of the Alpine Lookout. The foundation and lower floors are still standing. Moss-covered stone walls rise out of the forest floor. Stone columns lie scattered among the trees. You can still trace the outline of the pond. When the leaves fall in autumn, the ruins flicker into view from the Palisades Interstate Parkway for a moment before disappearing again behind the trees. It's the last visible remnant of Millionaire's Row, a Gilded Age ghost hiding on a cliff above the Hudson. And finally, we end at the place where millions of people entered this country for the first time, only to watch the building that welcomed them get abandoned and left to nature. The Central Railroad of New Jersey Terminal in Jersey City was built in 1889 in the Richardsonian Romanesque style, and for decades it was one of the busiest transportation hubs on the East Coast. At peak service, it processed between 30,000 and 50,000 passengers a day across 300 trains and 128 ferry runs. But the terminal's most significant role was as the gateway for immigration. After being processed on Ellis Island, immigrants boarded ferries that brought them directly to this terminal. From here, they boarded trains heading to New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and beyond. An estimated 10.5 million immigrants entered the United States through this building. The decline of the railroads, the rise of the automobile, and the opening of tunnels and bridges across the Hudson slowly strangled the terminal's traffic. The Central Railroad of New Jersey went bankrupt in 1967, and the terminal closed on April 30th of that year. For over a decade, it just sat there. The platforms rusted. Trees and shrubs pushed through the tracks. The train shed, which once covered 20 platforms and was the largest bush-type shed ever built, lost its copper roofing to thieves and became an open-air greenhouse of weeds and wild growth. In 1976, it was incorporated into the newly created Liberty State Park. The head house was eventually restored and reopened in 1980. Then Hurricane Sandy in 2012 devastated it again, and it sat closed for 4 more years until a $20 million renovation brought it back. Today, the terminal building is beautiful, housing a museum and the departure point for ferries to Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty. But step behind the building and you'll see the old train shed and platforms still fenced off, still overgrown, still frozen in the moment the last train pulled away. It's the most poetic ending on this list. A building that welcomed millions of people to a new life, abandoned by the industry that made it possible, then slowly brought back to life by the same park system that saved it. The front is restored, the back is still a ruin, and from the ferry dock, you can see the Statue of Liberty across the water, close enough to feel like it's watching. So there it is. Places in New Jersey that got left behind. Safari parks, military bases, ghost towns, and cathedrals of concrete. Every one of them was built by people who thought what they were making would last forever. And every one of them is a reminder that nothing does. If you're from this state, you owe it to yourself to visit at least one. New Jersey's got more secrets than it lets on. It always has.